The Vrethkai had been cataloging prey species for 11,000 years, and Lieutenant Silenus walked into their database like a wound that wouldn't close. He came to awareness slowly, which was his first mistake by their accounting. A prey creature should surface from unconsciousness in a burst of adrenaline, limbs scrambling, eyes wide and white-rimmed, the whole gorgeous machinery of terror running at full capacity. Instead, Silenus lay on the membrane floor of specimen chamber 44 and performed a systematic inventory of his body. Fingers first, then toes, then the slow rotation of both wrists to check for fractures. He noted the faint vibration coming up through the floor, a harmonic in the range of 11 hertz, which told him the ship's drive was spooled down to station keeping and the quality of the recycled air, which carried a faint sweetness like oxidized copper and something organic he couldn't name. He noted the bioluminescent pulse of the membrane walls, cycling blue to blue again on roughly a 4-second interval. He noted the other creatures in the chamber with him. A Pelhari calf, pressed into the far corner, its 4 eyes sealed behind nictitating membranes. Its lateral frills collapsed flat against its neck, something that resembled a terrestrial horseshoe crab, if horseshoe crabs grew to the size of dining tables and had 12 legs. A cluster of gas bag creatures he didn't recognize, bunched against the ceiling and trembling in slow unison. Then he sat up, brushed a smear of violet bioluminescence from his sleeve, and began to look at the walls. He had been on the survey shuttle Perseid when the tractor field took them. He remembered the way the instruments went dead first, not one by one, but all at once, as though someone had simply switched off the concept of technology, and then the hull groaning in a language he didn't have a word for. And Specialist Drew Ames saying, "Oh," very softly, with the particular inflection of someone who has just understood something irreversible. The shuttle had been pulled into a bay so large that Silenus, looking through the port, could not find the ceiling. He had last seen Drew Ames being guided through a different corridor by 2 creatures he later understood were Vrethkai, tall, chitinous, their movements carrying the kind of precision that spoke of absolute confidence in their own authority over the space they occupied. He hoped Drew Ames was in a chamber like this one, and not somewhere worse. The membrane wall was not opaque. Stand at the right angle, and the bioluminescent layer thinned enough to suggest the corridor beyond shapes moving past. Unhurried. Deliberate. Silenus pressed his palm flat against the surface. It was warm. Not machine warm, but organically warm, and it gave slightly under pressure. And when he held his hand still for long enough, he could feel the membrane's own pulse. Very faint, running beneath his fingers. He tilted his head, almost smiled. He did not know, then, that he was being observed. He did not know that in the classification sanctum 2 corridors away, a Vrethkai called HFY was watching his biometric readout update in real time and growing very still in the way that Vrethkai grew still when something violated the architecture of their understanding. The biometric suite was thorough. It measured cortisol equivalents, pupil dilation, gross motor patterns, vocalizations, respiration rate. For every species in HFY's 40-year career, the numbers on first awakening in a specimen chamber told the same story. The sharp spike of panic, the desperate attempt at escape behavior, the gradual collapse into dissociative stillness as the prey brain accepted its situation and began to shut down unnecessary functions. It was a reliable sequence. HFY had seen it 4,000 times. The human's cortisol was elevated but not spiking. His pupils were wide, not with fear, but with interest. His respiration was slow and deepening. Not the shallow panting of the terrified, but the deliberate breathing of someone settling in to pay attention. He had pressed his hand against the membrane not to test for weakness but to feel it. And his head had tilted at a particular angle that HFY did not have a classification for. The Vrethkai had a vast taxonomy of prey behaviors. Curiosity was not among them. On the chamber floor, Silenus exhaled slowly through his nose, feeling the membrane's pulse against his palm. His ship was gone. Drew Ames was somewhere in this structure. The creatures around him were terrified in ways that suggested they had reason to be. He had no weapons, no communicator, and approximately the physical durability of wet cardboard compared to his hosts. He took his hand from the wall, turned, and began to study the geometry of the chamber's ventilation seams. By the time the lights cycled through their fourth interval, 16 minutes, he had traced the entire ventilation architecture visible from chamber 44. He scratched the schematic into the membrane's condensation layer with his fingernail. Not an escape map. Not yet. But a map of the ship the way a person maps a place they have decided to understand. There was a difference, and HFY, watching, did not yet have the framework to articulate it. The Pelhari calf opened one eye. Salinas looked at it directly, not the darting glance of a creature checking for threat, but the long, considered look of someone deciding to introduce themselves. He moved slowly, crossing half the distance between them. Then stopping. He sat down on the floor. He waited. The Pelhari's frills, very slightly, began to open. In the classification sanctum, HFY sat with the biometric readout for a long time after the lights cycled to their resting state. Then it pulled up the full taxonomic record for the species designated Homo sapiens, the preliminary file, assembled from the survey drone's observations, 17 pages of data that had led to the Tier 6 classification, and began to read it again. It had the sensation, faint and deeply uncomfortable, of having made an error. HFY had classified 4,000 species. None of them had ever asked it a question. It happened on the second cycle of the ship's day. HFY was in the middle of drafting the formal classification report. Homo sapiens, Tier 6, soft-tissued, fragile, estimated caloric yield, and potential for domestication when the alert came from Chamber 44. Not the alarm, which would have signaled escape behavior. The alert, the one designated for anomalous specimen activity that did not fit existing response protocols. HFY reviewed the sensor log. The human had studied the ventilation seams for 32 minutes. Then he had sat with the Pelhari calf for an additional 40, doing nothing except existing in its proximity, occasionally making soft sounds at a frequency that seemed to slow the calf's frantic respiration. Then he had stood, examined the membrane wall at 17 distinct points along its circumference, found the one seam where two membrane panels met at a slightly imperfect join, and applied thermal pressure. The warmth of his hands, held in sustained contact until the differential caused the join to part by approximately 4 centimeters. He had not used this opening to escape. He had used it to walk into the corridor, take stock of where he was, and then walk 2 corridors forward and through the open door of the classification sanctum, where he sat down across from HFY, as though this were something he had been invited to do. "You're the one watching me," Salinas said. His translator implant rendered the words into standard Vrethkai with a half-second lag, and the resulting sounds were imperfect, accented with the particular distortions of a larynx designed for different frequencies. But they were comprehensible. "I'd like to know what's happening to the other creatures in my chamber. Specifically, the 4-eyed one. It's injured. The R7 and Incis. In look divine and again." 2 Vrethkai guards arrived through the corridor behind him and stopped when HFY raised one foreclaw. The classifier studied the human for a long moment. He was smaller than it had expected. The biometric data was accurate, but data was not the same as presence. He sat in the chair across the desk with his spine straight and his hands open on his thighs and his eyes doing that thing they did, that wide and interested thing that HFY still did not have a word for. "You are a specimen," HFY said. "You will be returned to your chamber." "The Pelhari calf," Salinas said, as though HFY had not spoken, "has a laceration on its left lateral flank that I can't assess fully because of its frills. It's been holding that side at an angle that suggests pain. It needs medical attention. I'd like you to send someone. Very forwarding. ROPSC. Our forwarding T. Our forwarding T. The Pelhari is classified Tier 4. It is not your concern. It's in the same room as me, so it is. He paused. I'd also like to know where my crewmate is. Specialist Drew Ames. Taller than me, darker skin. She was wearing a green survey jacket. Specimens do not make requests. I'm making one anyway. His tone was not aggressive. It was not afraid. It was the tone of someone who has assessed a situation and determined that a particular course of action is reasonable and intends to pursue it regardless of the reception. I understand I don't have standing here. I understand your classification system puts me well below the threshold for diplomatic consideration. I'm asking anyway, because the Pelhari is hurt, and my crewmate is somewhere in this ship and I'd like to know she's okay. He met Eshvarath's primary eyes without looking away. I don't think that's an unreasonable thing to want. The guards were still waiting. Eshvarath was aware of them, the way it was aware of the ship's ventilation, hum present, functional, not requiring attention. The human should have been performing escape behavior, or dissociative collapse, or threat display. The Vrethkai taxonomy of prey responses was comprehensive. This was none of them. This was a creature sitting across a desk and making requests, as though it believed the universe organized itself around the principle that injured creatures deserved attention regardless of classification tier. Eshvarath did not know what to do with this belief. It was not a belief the Vrethkai hierarchy had ever needed to accommodate. The Pelhari will be assessed, it said, finally, and was aware of the strangeness of the concession, even as it made it. Something shifted in the human's face, not triumph, not relief, but a particular quality of attention, like a door opening. Thank you, Silenus said, and meant it. He returned with the guards to Chamber 44 without being told to. But he walked slowly, and he looked at every corridor they passed through, with that same tilted head attention he had given the membrane wall. And Eshvarath, watching through the ship's sensor net, understood that he was memorizing the layout, not for escape, for the map. In the 17 years Eshvarath had spent aboard the classification vessel, it had logged one unprecedented report. That had been for a species of burrowing creature from the Veth system that had displayed rudimentary tool use in captivity, a remarkable finding, but ultimately confirmable within existing taxonomic frameworks. The species was upgraded from Tier 7 to Tier 5. The report had taken 6 months to process. Eshvarath began drafting the second unprecedented report that evening. It wrote, "The specimen designated Homo sapiens. Individual unit catalogued 7. Silenus. Has displayed behavioral patterns not consistent with any known prey classification. Specific anomalies include unprompted investigation of environment, not for escape, but for comprehensive understanding. Interspecies bonding behavior initiated within 3 hours of first contact with Tier 4 specimen. Voluntary approach to classifier without provocation. Sustained eye contact without submission or aggression display. Verbal advocacy for third-party specimen welfare. Apparent absence of fear-dominant stress response." Eshvarath paused. Added. Classification suspended. Species requires new category. It filed the report and sat alone in the classification sanctum for a long time, looking at the door through which the human had walked, uninvited, and sat down. The Vrethkai had a word for the moment a prey species revealed hidden fangs Keshevarath, which translated roughly as the unmasking, the revelation of predator beneath, but they had never needed it for anything that bled as easily as a human. The uprising began, as most disasters do, with something small. A maintenance conduit in Sector 12 had been venting coolant at a fractionally elevated rate for 6 ship days. The consumed the prey species, conscripts who maintained the vessel's mechanical systems. Species from a dozen worlds working in the dim spaces behind the walls had noticed. They had reported it 3 times through proper channels. On the 4th day, the pressure differential became critical. and a Pelhari maintenance worker named Gesh Sa opened an access panel that should have been sealed, and was not, and the resulting rupture took out 40 meters of primary hull membrane along specimen hold 7. Explosive decompression in a living ship is not like decompression in a metal hull. The membrane tears rather than shatters, and the tear propagates along the bioluminescent network in a visible wave, a spreading darkness, and the sound it makes is not a bang, but a groan, long and low, and somehow personal, like a creature in pain. Silenus heard it, and was moving before the alarm sounded. He had spent 2 ship days memorizing corridors. He had spent those same 2 days talking to every creature in Chamber 44, in whatever approximation of communication they could manage hand signals, tonal mimicry, a shared visual language assembled from nothing over 40 hours of patient effort. He knew, because the Pelhari calf had shown him with a careful positioning of its frills, that the specimen holds were arranged along a single corridor with shared ventilation, which meant that a breach in hold 7 would affect holds 4 through 12 within minutes. He went out the membrane seam the same way he had before, moving fast now, and the corridor was chaos. Vrethakai crew moving in patterns that looked purposeful, but weren't. Their chitin plates raised in what he'd identified as a stress display, their communications a rapid-fire clicking that the translator rendered only partially. He moved through them, and they let him, too occupied with the crisis to process the anomaly of a Tier 6 specimen, walking free. He found Eshvarath at the intersection of corridors 9 and 12, standing very still in the particular way Vrethkai went still when their processing systems were overloaded. "The breach is in the outer membrane of hold 7, Silenus said. "The propagation will hit the shared ventilation intake for holds 4 through 9 in approximately," he calculated, 4 minutes. "If you can close the ventilation dampers manually, you stop the cascade. There's a manual coupling access point at the end of corridor 12. I found it on day 1. Eshvarath looked at him. "How do you know this?" "I paid attention. He was already moving toward corridor 12. Come on." What happened in the next 11 minutes would be recorded in Vrethkai ship logs with the designation Anomalous Event 7, Silenus, and the recording would be reviewed by the Council of Apexes 12 times before they agreed on how to classify it. The manual coupling access was a chamber at the corridor's end, open to space behind a membrane seal that was rated for 50 standard atmospheres but had never been tested in a breach scenario. Silenus assessed it in 3 seconds. The coupling itself was a physical latch system, a relic of older design, kept as backup, and it required sustained manual pressure to seat correctly under emergency conditions. The membrane seal would hold approximately 40 seconds of hard vacuum exposure. He had improvised a pressure wrap from a coolant conduit sleeve he'd pulled from the wall on the way. Not a suit. Not even close to a suit, but something between his skin and the vacuum. "How long can your species survive vacuum exposure?" Eshvarath asked, from behind him. "Long enough," Silenus said. "Or not. Either way, the coupling needs to be held. The probability of survival is—" "I know." He pulled the membrane seal aside. The cold hit him like a wall, not gradually but all at once, the temperature dropping 40 degrees in a single breath, the air rushing out around the partial seal with a sound like a scream going backward. He stepped through and gripped the coupling with both hands. The stars were there. He had not expected to feel that the specific quality of starlight on unshielded human skin, which is not warmth, but the absence of filtering, every frequency arriving direct and unmediated, the universe making contact without apology. The coupling was cold enough to burn. He held it. Eshvarath, watching through the sensor net that still functioned in this section, watched the human's biometric readouts cascade into extremis. Temperature dropping, blood pressure spiking as the circulatory system tried to compensate. The cortisol spike that hadn't come in the specimen chamber finally arriving now. Full force. The body's complete emergency response deployed not in panic, but in service of a held grip. 30 seconds. The coupling seated by millimeters as the pressure differential equalized across the system. 35 seconds. HFY could see the mathematics clearly. The human would lose consciousness before the coupling fully seated, and then the coupling would release, and the cascade would resume. At 38 seconds, 3 consumed workers, the Pelhari Gesha, among them, pushed past HFY and through the partial seal and added their hands to the coupling, their own bodies taking the exposure. Their combined strength and weight, and stubborn insistence on the coupling's completion, carrying the mechanism the last 4 millimeters to its locked position. The seal closed. The cascade stopped. Silenus was pulled back through into the corridor, and he was laughing. Frostbitten along both hands, the skin of his face showing the early mapping of exposure damage, his thermal signs so far outside normal parameters that the biometric suite was simply displaying a question mark. And he was laughing. A sound with no fear in it. A sound that was pure and baffled delight at the fact of his own survival, and the survival of the seam, and the 4-eyed Pelhari calf somewhere in hold 5, who was still breathing because the cascade had been stopped. The consumed workers stood around him. The Pelhari made a sound he didn't have a word for. He pressed his damaged hand against its flank anyway, very gently. HFY stood in the corridor and held something it could not classify. Its civilization had been built on a single, load-bearing certainty. The universe divides into those who devour and those who are devoured. Apex and prey. The hierarchy was not a preference, it was the architecture of reality. The organizing principle of 11,000 years of taxonomic work and political structure and philosophical tradition. The human had known the odds. It had known them precisely. HFY had told it, and had stepped through the membrane seal anyway, gripping a coupling in hard vacuum, because the alternative was that creatures it had known for 48 hours would die. The Vrithkai had a framework for sacrifice. Apex predators sacrificed tactical advantage for strategic dominance. They did not sacrifice themselves for Tier 4 prey species they had met 2 days ago. There was no framework for that. There was no word for it. HFY formally struck the classification 7, Silenus, from the taxonomic record that evening. In its place, it opened a new entry, not a tier, not a category, but a designation that sat outside the entire system, a notation the 11,000-year database had never held before. It wrote, Human, category, unknown, threat level, infinite. Then it sat for a long time with the cursor blinking at the end of that line, and added, because it was the most accurate thing it had ever recorded. They do not fight because they believe they will win. They fight because the thing on the other side of the fight is something they love. The universe has given us no preparation for this. We are not prepared. The Pelhari calf, in hold 5, pressed its frills open for the first time since its capture, fanning them wide in the posture that meant, in its own language, something between gratitude and recognition, the gesture made when one creature sees another clearly, for the first time, in full. In Corridor 12, Lieutenant Silenus sat on the floor with his burned hands in his lap and watched the stars through the membrane wall, and did not look like prey, and did not look like a predator, and did not look like anything the Vrethkai had 11,000 years of words for. He looked like something new,